So before we dive into today's session, let's run quickly through a few housekeeping points that will help everything run smoothly. This webinar is being recorded, and a recording of this will be included in the Circular Economy newsletter. The question and answer function will be open for you to submit your questions, and we will do our best to answer as possible, as many as we can during the webinar. All questions, including the ones we did not get to today, will be answered and published there. We recommend listening to the presentation first, as your question may be answered during the session. Questions submitted via the question and answer should relate specifically to today's content unless otherwise indicated. So can I just ask that cameras are switched off and mics are on mute? There won't be a chat function today. And once again, this session is being recorded for our records. In just a moment, you'll be hearing from Lorraine May, our policy expert, who will guide you through today's content, including our recent policy update, a new approach, key timelines, and most importantly, what actions you can take now to prepare. If you're all ready to be part of the change, we invite you to apply for our private beta. To be eligible to take part, your organisation must operate one or more licensed or permitted waste receiving sites in the UK, be able to work with your external software developers or internal development team, so you can provide data about the waste you receive via the receipt of a waste API. This is your chance to get early access, provide valuable feedback and help shape the future of digital waste tracking. The link to apply will be shared shortly, so stay tuned. I'm just going to pass you over to Lorraine May. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine, and welcome everybody to our webinar today. So what we thought we'd start with was a bit of a reminder of what it is we are trying to achieve with digital waste tracking. Obviously, the project's been going on for quite a while, so as I say, just a bit of a refresh about what we're aiming to do, what will be covered, etc. So once fully delivered, the digital waste tracking service is aiming to enable the tracking of all household, commercial and industrial waste. So that's what's known legally as controlled waste, whether it's hazardous or non-hazardous waste. In terms of tracking, what I mean here is that there'll be a digital waste tracking record that details where the waste has been generated, who has moved it, where it has ended up at a waste receiving site, and of course, crucially, what the waste is, the description of the waste. At the site where it ends up, it might get disposed of, treated, or it might just be an interim point along its journey, and the waste at that stage might be bulked up or just separated and then moved again from that point. And from that point, that's when a new digital waste record will be created. These digital records on the digital waste tracking system will ultimately replace existing waste transfer notes, hazardous waste consignment notes, and the Annex 7 documentation for exports. And the waste description that's currently on those records for duty of care purposes will form part of the digital record. And the digital records will have unique numbers assigned to them so that those involved in the waste movement will be able to use that to view the details of what the waste is and who's been involved in the management of it, and also to submit information regarding their involvement in the waste movement. And importantly, waste producers will be able to use that unique ID to see where their waste was taken. Next slide, please, Elaine. So a bit about the scale of the project, and I'm sure all of those on this call will recognise this is a transformational change for the waste industry, and it is in no way a simple task. There are a huge number of operators across the industry in terms of those who operate permitted sites, those who transport the waste, and those who act as brokers or dealers arranging waste movements. In addition, we've got a vast number of people who are registered waste exemption holders, and they provide outlets for lots of waste, but there's currently very little oversight of what this waste is, how much waste is involved, or what's happening to it under these exemptions. Within all these groups, there's great diversity in terms of the size of the business, from sole traders up to multinational companies, and varying levels of existing digital systems being used for recording details about the waste being handled or managed. But the aim is to enable everybody, all these people, to submit their data onto the central system. And that's really important for several reasons. One, as I've already mentioned, to help waste producers comply with their duty of care and check their waste has gone to legitimate sites. And then also, conversely, to enable regulators to more effectively identify and target those who are deliberately not complying with the waste rules. And also to ultimately inform waste policymakers across the UK, as this is a UK-wide 4 nations project, with a comprehensive data set to inform future waste policy. Next slide, please, Elaine. So, as I've already mentioned, we know that this project has been going on for a while, so I want to give a bit of background about what's been happening up to this point. So some of you may well have been involved in the testing of the service that was being developed last year. Well, that testing revealed that the format of the service being developed and delivered at that time was not practical for the majority of users. We heard through the testing and user research that the manual entry service was too cumbersome and the option for uploading spreadsheets was clunky and inefficient. Over that time, we also received a large number of inquiries about us developing an API. And for those who don't know or are not familiar with that term, I will explain more about what an API is in the next slide. But we received lots more requests, far more than we actually anticipated. So it started to become abundantly clear that we needed a rethink and a reset of the project, and that is what we've been doing over the past few months. So to do this, we reviewed the approaches taken in other countries and looked at how they've delivered digital waste tracking systems, and also reviewed the feasibility of an API first model. The team have conducted user research with a range of companies across the UK, coming out and doing site visits to understand the current use of digital systems and to discuss the data proposed to be collected. And from this work, we've looked at a number of different options for how we can deliver this digital waste tracking transformation in an effective way. And that's how we've come up with a new approach that was set out in the recent announcement. Next slide, please, Elaine. So what is this new approach? Well, the first thing to say is it's about building this incrementally in stages. Given the complexity and the scale of the operators that I've previously described, it's really important that we start somewhere that's going to help us get the foundations of the system right in the first place. And then we can build out from that and then capture the other operators in waste journeys and other parts of the system. So the most logical way to do this is to start with permitted site operators, capturing the end part of the waste movement in the first instance. It's important to note that this isn't about getting those waste site receivers to record everything. It's just the elements of the waste movement that they will ultimately be responsible for once the full end-to-end digital system is up and running. And most of that information is already recorded by waste receivers to enable them to submit quarterly returns required by their permits or hazardous waste returns. And when I'm talking about permitted site operators here, I'm talking about all those who hold a permit or in Scotland a waste management licence issued by the environmental regulators across the UK, whether it's a transfer station, a paper mill, an incinerator, a composting facility, etc., etc. It's any permitted waste receiving site, regardless of whether it's the final endpoint for the waste or an interim site along the waste journey. So the second point here is more about this API-focused approach. An API is essentially some digital code that links two bits of software together. So many waste receivers already use some form of system to record information about the waste coming onto their sites, be that on a spreadsheet or their own software that they've bought from a commercial company or that they've developed in-house themselves. And we want to enable people to be able to continue using those existing systems, but use this API to automatically send the data through to the digital waste tracking system. And by using that API first approach, we'll help to reduce the changes needed to current IT systems being used out there and also businesses' ways of working and processes. What this doesn't mean is that operators will have to go out and purchase specific software to do this. Our developers are also designing an option whereby a coded spreadsheet can be used, and that will have the API attached into the background digital code of that in order to send the data through to the digital system. Next slide, please, Elaine. So this is the simplified picture showing what this means from October 26 next year, when these requirements for permitted waste site operators will come into force. So at that point, because we won't be covering the full waste journey to a waste receiving site, transfer notes and hazardous consignment notes for hazardous waste will continue to exist and be required to be used as they are now. When the waste is taken into a waste receiving site, that operator of that site will make records of the waste received either on their own software or on the spreadsheet option I previously mentioned. And then that data will be sent via the API link onto the digital waste tracking system. The submission of that data will be required to be done within 2 working days of the waste being received onto the site. And then the system, the digital waste tracking system, will return a unique ID number for each entry. And that will enable the operator to make updates to the data as and when necessary. If you get waste onto the site and there was an error in the weight or the description, you can make changes to the data as and when needed, but that will all be auditable in the trail of the record. And at that point, once the data is onto the digital waste tracking system, the data will then be available for the regulators to make use of. So the next 2 slides show a pictorial version of the 2 different options I've been talking about. So this first one is the API first approach, but for receivers who have existing or in the future, if they want to get commercial waste recording software, this is how it would work. So the waste is received, the waste operator on the weighbridge puts in the required details about the waste. As I say, most of that will be information that's already recorded, and that the API will pick this up and it will be sent across through to the waste tracking data store. So it's the API and the data store form what we're looking at as the waste tracking service. And then coming out of that, the regulators and policy colleagues across the UK will be able to use that data for their own needs. Next slide, please, Elaine. And then this is the alternative for those who don't have dedicated waste recording software. So I've got a spreadsheet here. We're actually looking at options that involve Excel, Google Sheets and OpenOffice, which is a free software that can be used similar to Excel. So these options that will be available, as I say, will have the API in the back of it already for you. So if you haven't got your own software, you can use this template to record the information. Many of you will already be using Excel or something like that, I would imagine anyway. So you'd use this template with the API and it will work in exactly the same way, so that this data will then be sent via the API into the waste tracking service for the regulators and policy people to be able to use that. Next slide, please, Elaine. So what are the benefits of this approach? We know it might seem strange that we are starting with the end of the waste movement and with operators who already submit waste returns and hazardous waste returns. But by starting with that smaller defined group of operators means we can really focus the build and the test of the system to establish that solid foundation that we need in order to have confidence that the system is working and the data that's being submitted onto it is the right data. One of the biggest challenges we've had with this project is being able to engage with all potential users and get them on board. As I've set out, the numbers are huge here in terms of those stakeholders that we have interested in this project and need to be involved in this project. And if we bite off more than we can chew and try and tackle too much in one go, then we risk ending up with a system that's full of gaps, not well complied with, and we will not ultimately be able to assess uptake or achieve the reduction in waste crime that we want. By starting with permitted waste receivers, we can begin to get more accurate data about the volumes of waste movements occurring and the parties involved in those waste movements, helping us to inform the next stages of development and identify those we need to get on board. And ideally, we'd love it if the permitted site operators can help us with that, talking to their customers about what the customers need to get involved in and what they'll need to do moving forward into the next phases. Next slide, please. The timeline then, what is going to be happening when, and this was set out in the recent announcement, but I will cover it again here. So from autumn this year, that's when we will be going into the private beta phase for the developing IT service. So this is the phase that will be focusing on those waste receivers, and we're encouraging those operators, as Elaine mentioned at the start, with permits or licenses to get on board with this as early as possible. And the link will be shared in the Q&A and on other announcements and things coming out. So the private beta stage is essentially the initial testing of the service. And for those who sign up, people will be invited to join up and test the service in growing numbers, give us your feedback, let us know whether it's working for you, how it's being implemented in your organisation. So that will begin from autumn this year, go through to April 2026, when we will have developed the service further based on the feedback of those in the private beta phase. And at that point in April 2026, the service will be publicly available. So we call that the public beta phase. It'll be available for all permitted and licensed receiving site operators. To build into their business processes, the spreadsheet option will be available for everybody. And of course, you also have the option of going to a commercial software operator. At the same point in April 2026, governments across the UK will be laying or have laid their legislation to bring the requirements for permitted site operators into force from October 2026. And that's the point, October 2026, when that legislation will become mandatory and all permitted and licensed waste receiving site operators will be required to enter the data through the API onto the digital waste tracking system. Of course, while all this is ongoing, the team are also going to be looking at the design, development and engagement plans for the next phase from 2027, when we plan to have the service ready for expansion to capture the rest of the waste movement. So, i.e. creating digital waste records and capturing the movement from the waste producers to the waste receivers. So it'll be at that point from 2027 when waste carriers, waste brokers, waste producers will be more involved in entering data onto the system or reviewing data that's put on the system. Next slide, please. So this is the high-level journey for permitted and licensed waste receiving site operators up until that October 2027 point. So the first stage, and for all those of you who are on this webinar or who are on the previous webinar, you're already in this stage. You're already looking to get awareness about what's happening, how this is going to impact you, how you can get involved. So this is all about signing up for the newsletters, attending webinars, visiting the website, and we've also got other places which we shall talk about later on in this webinar as well, which you can go to keep up to date and get really involved in the detail about what you're going to need to know, what the data is that's needs to be submitted, and how you can get access to the developing system. So the next stage is integrating with waste tracking. As I said, getting involved in the private beta. This is really about software providers, IT managers within companies, and also testing that Excel or other Google Sheets option within your business. So you'll have access to testing environments and also to our user researchers to provide feedback, etc. So once we've been through those stages, there'll be a point then where you'll need to register your organisation. So there will be a kind of a typical .gov.uk type website where you'll go on, register your organisation, and then invite others in your company, if there are any others, who you'll want to be involved in managing the account or any admin related to this. And then, as set out in the government response to our consultation on digital waste tracking, there will be a service charge for the digital waste tracking service. It will be in the region of £20. We're just working out the finer details of that, but that will be an annual charge for access to the service. And you'll be able to, depending on what point you go on and register your organisation, you'll be able to pay that charge or enter details but defer the payment to a later point before the system becomes mandatory. And at that point, you'll start configuring the setup. So if you're an organisation that has several permitted or receiving sites, then you'll need to set up an API key per site so that when that site sends data through to the digital waste tracking system, the system will know which site that information is coming from and can populate it in the right place on the service. And then it will be about configuring any software. And really, that's the point where all that preparatory work is done. And then you'll be into the providing data point where that data will be being sent through to the digital system, and the unique ID numbers for each record will be starting to be returned. And then that's really the point where you're doing your job. It's been fully integrated, and the data will be coming through into the waste tracking data store and ready to be there for the regulators across the UK to start doing analysis on it. From this webinar today, one thing I'd really like you to take from it is if you are a permitted or licensed waste receiving site operator, we'd really like you to sign up for the private beta testing. And in that, this is what I referred to earlier. So this is a particular web page, and it's called a GitHub page. Something that I hadn't heard of before working with the digital developers. But GitHub is essentially like a cloud-based notebook for digital code. It helps individuals and teams work together on software projects, track changes and fix mistakes. It's like Google Docs, but for code, essentially. But importantly, it's not just for techie people. There is information on the site about the vision for the system, an example storyboard that sets out what the full end-to-end journey is proposed to look like. So if you see in this first screenshot, down the left-hand side, you've got a service vision storyboard, process diagram, and then a bit more about this initial phase with the receivers, specific to receivers, process diagram, data requirements, draft API specification. So in our last webinar, people were asking about that. Here it is. Go to this GitHub page, and there should be a link in the Q&A section, and you can go and look at that draft API specification and the data fields on there. But what I'll draw your attention to is to the bottom left-hand corner where it says apply to test the service in beta. And as I say, please, if you're a waste receiver, permitted or licensed, please go on and sign up to that, because it's all about, this is the way that you'll get to understand how the systems plan to work and what changes you'll need prior to October 2026. And this bottom screenshot here is it's a screenshot of the data fields. But as I say, if you go to some of those links down the left-hand side on this GitHub page, you'll find all this detail. Next slide, please. So again, what can you be doing now? I've literally just said it, but I'm going to say it again. If you're a permitted waste site receiver, please sign up to private beta. If you're not a permitted waste site receiver, if you're a carrier, broker, dealer, any of those other waste industry representatives, then I'd encourage you to sign up to our broader user panel. And again, hopefully the link is in the Q&A, but if not, we will share it. Because we will be beginning to conduct user research and design work to inform that further expansion of the system to those other operators, i.e., looking at how we design the system to collect the information about that movement of waste from the producer via the carrier to the waste receiving site, how we're going to replace season tickets, how we're going to join up records, etc. And so your input will be really crucial with that. That user panel list is used to select people to be involved in different user research activities. Some of the feedback we had before last year was people had signed up to the user panel and felt they weren't being contacted very much or kept up to date. The user panel is there, and we ask people to sign up, but it won't mean that every week you'll be invited to testing. So we're trying to get as broad a range of people testing, being involved in different activities as much as possible. So, well, one, to reduce the burden on people, so we're not asking you to be involved in stuff all the time, but also so that we can ensure that we get as many views and opinions on what we're doing as possible. So we can't guarantee that you'll be being invited to things all the time, but we do use that user panel list also to get comms out to people. So it's a good way as well to get awareness of what's going on and to keep up to date. And then, of course, look out for future webinars such as this, which we'll be trying to do a lot more regularly as the system is being developed, and also keep up to date through the Circular Economy newsletter. Some of you may have also heard about our industry co-design group that we're setting up. The first meeting of this is today, this afternoon, and that group is bringing together representatives from industry and the environmental regulators across the UK to help provide ideas and input on a variety of aspects of the developing system. This isn't an open group. Participants for this group have been selected by us to ensure that we've got good spread across different sectors, sizes of business and locations across the UK. So I said it's not an open group. I know people are really keen to be involved, but we do have to, it's a working group, so we do have to manage the participants of that group, and we will be keeping it under review. So if we feel that we're lacking in certain areas and certain representation, we will select more people. And again, we will go back to those who are on the user panel for that. So if you want to be involved, sign up to that user panel. But we will, however, be providing summaries of those meetings with the interested trade associations. So if you're part of a trade association that related to waste, then we will be sending summaries of those meetings out as well. Next slide, please. So on that note, hopefully we don't see too many of these plastic bags in trees very often, but I'd just like to say thank you for your attendance today. As we mentioned earlier, the recording of the webinar will be available online in due course, and we will take away any questions that we haven't answered in the session today and share them in the next Circular Economy newsletter. But if you've got any further questions in the meantime, please contact us at this address. Other than that, once again, thank you for your attendance, and that is the end of the webinar today.